Hey everybody, Yankee here. I want to come on here today and talk about a huge misconception that a lot of people seem to have in the gun community. Now, I would say it was just younger people, but it seems like a lot of older people have also fallen for this lie. And that is that gun rights are more under attack now than ever. We enjoy our rights less now than we ever could before. We're more restricted now. There's always a constant onslaught, and we just keep losing because they just keep stalling, blah, 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 and it's one thing after another. And that we actually have less rights now. And that's just not the case. As someone who's old, and I guess not suffering from dementia like some of these guys, I remember what it was like in the 70s and 80s. And no one exercised their Second Amendment rights like they do today. They didn't have the leeway to do so back then that they have today. A lot of people seem to think that, before, like the 80s, everybody could just carry what they wanted, where they wanted, when they wanted, and there were no laws against it and blah, blah, blah. And that's just not the case. It's not the case at all. And also, it wasn't the case that people accepted it socially. I remember in the 70s, if anyone carried a gun, and this is in a small town in West Virginia, if you carried a handgun, people said, he carries a handgun, he must be a criminal. You were assumed to be nefarious if you carried a handgun. Now, sometimes people had rifles in their trucks. Usually people who lived on farms. People who lived in town didn't. The guys who pulled up into the high school parking lot with rifles in the back of their window, a truck window, they lived out in the country. Those were tools of the trade for where they lived, to put food on the table, protect livestock, etc. But no one walked around open carrying a pistol, or even concealed carrying hardly. Almost no one did it. And some people think, well, they just didn't do it, but they had the right to. No, they didn't. There were not a lot of federal laws regarding where you could carry, when you could carry, etc., because it really wasn't a thing, but lots of states had laws against it. A lot of people think that back in the Old West, you could just take a gun anywhere. No, the reality was you were very restricted on where you could take guns back then. You have to remember that until recently, like in the last decade, they had not clarified, or at least confirmed, that the Second Amendment is an individual right. That had never been decided by the courts before. Up until then, they always left it open to whether it was an individual right or a collective right. So states were free to pretty much do what they wanted. And the Second Amendment didn't come into play because the federal government didn't say, well, it's an individual right, therefore it can be protected. And the courts didn't do that either. Now we have the courts coming in and saying, hey, this is an individual right. You can't infringe upon it. And that is such a change over the way things used to be. Like I said, this attitude towards guns isn't what people thought it was back in the day. Like I said, in the 70s, the federal government didn't do a lot about carry laws because not a lot of people carried. They did things about what, you could buy and who you could buy it from, things like that. But as far as saying, oh, you can't carry here, you can't carry there, they didn't do that because they didn't need to do that. Because it just wasn't a thing. Like I said, it hadn't even been declared an individual right. It was written as an individual right, but the courts had never confirmed that. They'd always stepped around it so that states could act as if it was an individual right. It was way worse back then than it is now, as far as you having the freedom to exercise your Second Amendment right as an individual. Don't forget that. I know big gun groups like the NRA, the GOA, they want you to think different. They want to think you're under attack like you never have been before, or else why would you give them money? I know the big gun channels want to fearmonger because fear sells and it gets them sponsors and it gets their videos watched. But the reality is we're kind of living in a golden age of firearms right now. Not only do we have more availability, a bigger market than ever because people are exercising their rights more, but we also have more protected rights than ever before when it comes to our guns. Back in the day, back in the 70s, let's say if Ohio said, you can't carry guns into stadiums, you can't carry guns at parades, you can't carry guns here, there was no real defense against that. Because the Supreme Court would not say that this is an individual right. They'd say, well, this is a collective right, and therefore, since you're not acting as part of a militia in those places, well, then we're not stepping in. There were tons of laws against carrying back then that have since been wiped from the books because they're now unconstitutional. That's why the left is so desperate now. That's why they're writing these bad bills like 1504 that they can't even defend, because they can't attack your right anymore, because the right has been established. The Supreme Court has said you have an individual right to keep and bear arms. You have an individual right to carry those firearms outside your home. And you have an individual Second Amendment right to use that handgun in self-defense. That's never been the case before in history. Never have we won victories that decisive, that specific. So we are, like I said, living in a golden age of firearms. That doesn't mean we don't have to fight, because like I said, the most dangerous animal is one that's wounded and cornered. And right now the anti-gunners are wounded and cornered. So we got to keep our eyes open for those sneak attacks and those underhanded attacks. And we got to pay attention and we got to fight. But we are winning. Don't let big gun groups convince you different. We're winning on the ground level, the grassroots level. We don't need them. They're an outdated concept. All they do is suck away 80% of the profits. Like the NRA raising money off of 1504, they don't send any of it here. They send a pittance. You know, if they raise $100, they spend $2 in the state. They send their representative that's on staff to come and talk at meetings and usually sell their apps and stuff while they're doing it. So, like I said, don't buy into this thing that, we're losing, because that's a defeatist attitude. We're winning. We've won more than we ever won before. Like I said, this is not the dark ages of firearms ownership. Just look at the market that exists. Look at the entertainment side of it that exists, YouTube, etc. We are living in the golden age of firearms, and don't let anyone tell you different. Don't let anyone discourage you from standing up saying, these are my rights. I have them. I'm keeping them. And you can try any little desperate attempt you want, but we will fight you and we will win.